Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in game number 8 of the 2016 World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karjakin. So far we've played 7 games, we've had 7 ties, a few pretty exciting games. Magnus Carlsen, few chances, probably could have won, but all in all, there's definitely been some games that didn't last very long, were not that exciting in my opinion, but game number 8, Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces, going to be looking to really take the advantage in this match with only 5 games remaining, including this one. So he definitely wants to make sure he comes out strong. He only has the white pieces a few more times in this tournament. Sergei Karjakin playing the black pieces. He's trying to hold strong here. He's been playing defense most of the tournament. Hasn't put too much pressure on Magnus Carlsen. So he wants to just continue doing that, filling his opponent out. If anything, they can get to a tiebreaker after 12 games and then get to some blitz and rapid games. So I think all in all, Sergei Karjakin's game plan is pretty solid. Magnus Carlsen starts out with pawn to d4. Not something we see very often. Usually going to be seeing that pawn to e4. Now, we did see Magnus Carlsen start the tournament, game number 1, with pawn to d4, which was very odd, and then bishop to g5, but that didn't last too long. It was a pretty unexciting draw, if you remember game number 1. But pawn to d4, a knight f6, knight f3, pawn to d5, and then pawn to e3. So opening we don't see very often. A pawn to e6, and then bishop to d3. So getting into kind of the Cole system, pawn to c5, a pawn here to b3, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop here to b7, and then bishop to e7. Now, if you kind of look at the main line of the Cole system, usually it continues with knight to c6, trying to control the center of the board, getting your knights out before bishops. A lot of times you'll hear that said in opening theory. Castle on the king side, bishop to d6, centralizing that bishop, bishop to b2, trying to control the dark squares in the center of the board, castle on the king side. But Magnus Carlsen changed it up a little bit and said, I'm going to go ahead and play bishop to e7 first. Castle, castle, bishop here to b2. And then from Sergei Karjakin's standpoint, he really would like to bring his knight involved into the game. You usually want to get your knights, control the center of the board, but he recognizes that eventually he wants to play pawn here to b6, solidifying the pawn chain. Since this pawn chain right here on f7, e6, and e5 are blocking his light square bishop, he's probably not going to be bringing his bishop here. Eventually he wants to play pawn here to b7 or b6 and then bring his bishop here to b7. So knowing that, he has some options for his knight. He could play knight here to d7, knight here to c6, which would be a very common move, but he wants to give himself some flexibility depending on how Magnus Carlsen is continue. If Magnus Carlsen plays knight here to c3, you'll probably see something along the lines of knight here to c6, but he decides to wait and play pawn to b6, just giving him that flexibility. Wait to see what his opponent does. Magnus Carlsen decides to go and take on c5. Bishop recaptures. You can't see this symmetrical line from Sergei Karjakin with his pawn structures, and he's been playing this a lot of the tournament. It's kind of what he seems to be very familiar with, very comfortable with as far as defending, especially on the black side. So all in all, didn't expect too much different from Karjakin. Knight here to d2, and then from that, bishop to b7. Trying to control the light squares, getting more material involved to the game. Queen here to e2, completing the development from Magnus Carlsen, and the knight to d7, as we discussed before. He did have some options. Good thing he waited. He really likes the knight here on d7. This can always just jump into action now that there is kind of an opening here on the c file with the semi-open file. He could always bring this over to the queen side if he wants to start a big attack on that side. Carlsen continues with pawn to c4. And Karjakin takes here on c4. Now, I thought he had some other options that we may see on board. I thought rook to c8, trying to control the semi-open file. I thought that makes a lot of sense. Even queen to e7, completing his development, I think makes sense. That's probably better than queen to c7. This doesn't look as good because now if the pawn takes on d5, when we see a recapture, all of a sudden rook to c1, pinning down this bishop, can't really move. Can start to put a lot of pressure on that pawn to c4 after you remove this defender on d5. Just puts the queen in too much pressure. I just don't think Karjakin needs to worry about that. But he decides to go ahead and take here on c4. And the knight recaptures queen here to e7, so completing his development as well. a3 just consolidating here on b4. and then immediately response from Karjakin, he played pawn to a5. And he does need to make sure that he controls this b4 square. You don't want your opponent playing a pawn to b4, forcing that bishop back. It is on a very, very nice outpost here on c5. And now white, he can't play this pawn here to b4. You just see the capture here, and then the bishop's going to recapture. That's clearly going to be bad for Magnus Carlsen. So correctly plays pawn down here to a5, knight to d4, centralizing. Rook over here to d8, getting both the rooks involved into the game. Rook here to d1, rook here to c8, and then rook here to c1. So both sides kind of have the same mindset, and they're just kind of, as you see, the center of the board. They have a lot of material. Each side 2 pawns off the board, and they're just kind of waiting for some fireworks in the center of the board. Now the knight's going to come back here to f8, just opening up the door for the rook here on d8 to really hone down and control the center of the board. And he may want to bring it over here to g6, start to attack on the king side if he wants to. Queen back here to e1. It's kind of tough to figure out how Magnus Carlsen is going to continue in this spot. He could try, pawn to h3. That's not super exciting. It does stop the knight coming down here to g4. So that's something. But as far as where else he really goes, so, I mean, he could always bring knight to c2. Looks like a possibility. Opening up the door for, this rook to kind of control a little bit more. His bishop's not going to be doing too much. So all in all, he played queen down here to e1. I don't really think he loved it too much, but I don't think he has tons of options here. Knight here to g6, and then bishop to f1. Now, I'm not a huge fan of bishop to f1, getting your queen and your bishop. He is opening up the door for his rook here on d1 to attack, but it seems a little counterintuitive to be playing the white pieces and then just retreat all of your material back. Not a huge fan from Magnus Carlsen, but knight here to g4 from Karjakin. Knight to b5, very nice square. It's going to be tough to kind of kick this off. You can always have an outpost if he wants to play pawn here to a4, and you really don't want you have this double bishop pair. You really don't want to be doing anything with this knight with your bishop. So it's going to be tough, especially with your opponent's knights on the other side of the board. Bishop here to c6, attacking pawn here to a4, as we talked about, solidifying nice little outposts for both of these knights, and then bishop down here to d5. Also, somewhat odd just to see the bishop moving down here to c6 and then moving to d5. It has some other options. He didn't have to play a bishop to c6. He could have played queen down here to g5. And then, maybe pawn to h3, forcing the knight back. Knight comes to e5. Could see a capture here. Knight takes back on e5. Bishop takes, queen here to e5. We have Karjakin with a double bishop pair. Very good board presence, very active queen on board. You have some passive material back here, queen and bishop back on the first rank. So I thought this would have been a nice little alternative. He decided to go ahead and play bishop here to c6. Then he made to play bishop here to d5. So bishop to d4. So both sides just get material back in the center of the board. And then we start to see some exchange. So bishop takes on c4. Rook takes, bishop takes, rook recaptures, and then all of a sudden we do see some exchange. I think Magnus Carlsen probably comes out ahead. He's controlling the center of the board a little bit more. If the rook were to come down here and take, he recaptures. He has very good board presence with his pawns. He has a nice little outpost over here with his knight on b5. He has the only bishop on board, which I think bodes extremely well with pawn structures on either side of the board. Neither side has the best queen on board, but all in all, I would give this a slight edge to Magnus Carlsen. Carlsen continues with queen here to d2. Just getting this on the d file, make sure he controls that as much as possible. Rook over here to b8. Just maneuvering over to the queen side a little bit, protecting this backward pawn here on b6. Pawn here to g3. Knight to e5, bishop to g2. Nice little square from this bishop here on g2, controlling a lot of the board. Can always centralize it if it needs to, but wasn't doing too much on f1. Now it is very involved into the game. Pawn to h6, pawn up here to f4. So Magnus Carlsen being somewhat aggressive, starting to attack on the king side. Knight up here to d7, knight to a7, and then the queen comes down here to a3. So trying really to get all up in Magnus Carlsen's side of the board. Somewhat interesting to see that. So if he can start to get some material to help with that, he could start to have an attack. But he is attacking this pawn here on a4. We see the knight come back here to c6, attacking the rook. The rook's going to come over here to f8, and then pawn to h3. And I thought pawn to h3 was somewhat interesting. I think it's going to be giving up material he doesn't have to do. He does have some other options on board. He could take, rook takes on d7 would be interesting. Knight takes on d7, queen takes on d7. We see capture here on e3, king to f1, g5. I think that this is fairly interesting for white, although he has kind of an exposed king. I think he has a pretty good structure here. But decides instead to play h3, and then knight over here to c5. So a great outpost move for this knight, starting to, as we talked about, maneuver material over to the queen side of the board, starting to put pressure on Magnus Carlsen. King here to h2. Knight to a5, so capturing material, up a pawn in material on the board now. A rook up here to d8, so Magnus Carlsen says, I'll give up a pawn because I have a pretty strong initiative to start to attack. Rook up here to d8, pawn to g6, allowing for just an avenue for this king to come if he needs to. Queen up here to d4 says, yeah, okay, that defender in g7 was protecting this knight, so I'm going to go ahead and attack that. King here to g7, really need to hold on to that material. And then what I was kind of expecting is rook here to d7. Strong attack on the square here on f7. The knight can't move because it is being pinned down right here. Magnus Carlsen decided, hey, I only gave up one pawn material. Let's give up more material. He plays pawn to c5. Don't like this move at all. Rook takes on d8, knight takes on d8, then all of a sudden the knight recaptures here on c5, outpost for this knight. Nice little square. This knight appears no longer really doing too much, really needs to get back into the center of the board, really controlling stuff. And black has 2 pawns of material, and they are both passed, and they are looking to be pushed. I think Magnus Carlsen kind of put himself in a tough spot. Now Magnus Carlsen continues with queen to d6, and immediately we see Sergei Karjakin give the advantage back. He plays queen here to d3. I don't know if he was just expecting Magnus Carlsen to immediately just take here, and then he could exchange and just say, hey, we're going to the end game and I have 2 pawn advantage. But Magnus Carlsen does not want to do that at all, and he's not going to. Instead, he plays knight takes on e6 check, which is an extremely strong move. And after the pawn takes, then queen up here to e7. King to g8, and then the knight's going to fall, and just kind of gave that material back as we talked about. If we continue, pawn here to a4, pawn up here to e4, queen d7, just taking more material. All of a sudden, 4 pawns to 4 pawns, no advantage at all. So, and think about how much different this is if we were to come back on board and say, if we're here, instead of the queen taking or queen coming to d3, let's say he instead played queen to a4. Okay, queen to a4, then all of a sudden we have to see maybe pawn to g4. He can't really do that, knight to e6, because then all of a sudden the knight takes and the queen never can come down and capture that queen. It's not there anymore, so this is going to be extremely bad. So maybe we say, okay, what if the queen were to take on b6? Okay, there's a pawn material he could take. Then all of a sudden, knight to d7, forcing the queen to move. Queen back here to a7, queen up here to b5, knight here to c6. And then you just start pushing the pawn. It's very tough for Magnus Carlsen to try to control that. So all in all, I do think he gave that material back after queen to d3. As we kind of continued with knight takes. And then as we maneuver a little bit around, this is kind of where we stand. Queen to g6 check. Karjakin responds with queen to g7, says, hey, if you want to go ahead and take my queen, that's fine. I'll exchange, and then I'll go ahead and push my pawn down. You can't really stop it. Magnus Carlsen correctly decides that's not the path he wants to take. So queen up here to e8, queen here to f8, and says, hey, let's try that again if you'd like to. Magnus Carlsen says, no thanks. Queen here to c6, queen over here to d8, pawn up to f5. So Magnus decides to start pushing our own pawns. That's the only path if we are going to continue playing, not try for any sort of perpetual check. The best path to victory is starting to push our own pawns. So that's what he does. Pawn here to f5. And then on the queen side of the board, if you have a passed pawn, rule number 1, push that passed pawn. Rule number 2, protect the passed pawn. Rule number 3, continue to push the passed pawn. So pawn to a3, pawn takes here on e6, king here to g7. Pawn here to e7 just gives that material up. and then queen over here to b7 or b6. So it says, okay, I'll give up that pawn. It wasn't going to do too much. I didn't have the material I really need to hold on to that. So I'm going to give up that so that I can take your pawn on b6. Now I have to worry about 2 passed pawns. I just have to worry about 1 over on the queen side of the board. Knight down to d3. So Sergei Karjakin, this is a nice little interesting move. He's starting to put more pressure on his opponent. Bringing the knight down here to d3 really makes Magnus Carlsen kind of sit there and ponder, how he's going to continue. He in his head, he knows this is a drawn game, but he also doesn't want to mess this up for any reason, especially since he has the white pieces. That would be a catastrophe in the 8th game of this tournament. So he thinks for a while, plays queen here to a5, attacking this pawn here on a3. Queen down here to c5 says, hey, let's go ahead and exchange. Magnus Carlsen, again, rightfully says, no thanks. Queen here to a6. Knight to e5. Queen over here to e6. It says, I just want to stop this pawn from moving forward if the queen moves. Potentially it's not going to protect this. So nice little square. Pawn here to h5. And then Magnus Carlsen, as far as kind of where he moves from here, he has a few options. I don't know that any of them are amazing as far as how he continues on board. As far as finding an attack, I think he's definitely in defense mode right now. But he could play, queen to a6, try to hold on to it from there. That's one option. He could try queen to b3 and just try to hold on from there. But he somehow finds a really terrible move, probably the worst move of the tournament so far, and he played pawn to h4. And what he didn't recognize is that he left this square here on g4 vulnerable to the knight coming to g4. And that's unfortunate because Sergei Karjakin, not too long after this, played pawn to a2, putting too much pressure. All of a sudden, pretty much the queen has to take here on a2, but after the queen takes on a2, then this game's pretty much over. And after pawn to a2, Magnus Carlsen actually resigned in the game. To play this out so you can see how it may have gone, if the queen were to take here on a2, this would be the fastest loss Magnus Carlsen could have. Knight to g4, check. King up here to h3. Queen down here to g1. And then all of a sudden, this knight can't be attacked. We do have checkmate coming here on h2. So it has to do something else. So bishop to f3, getting out of the way. Knight down here to f3 or f2, and you can see after check, the queen is forced to come over. He's going to lose his queen. If for some reason Magnus Carlsen wanted to play a longer game and say let's play queen to a6, then all of a sudden queen down here to f2, queen here to a3, knight to f3 check, king up here to h1 or h3, knight to e1. Attacking the bishop, queen over here to c3. Remember that Magnus Carlsen this entire time always has to be aware that the pawn can come down here to a1. So there was a check, king over here to h7, queen up here c7. Eventually just can't stop it. Queen up here to f6 kind of puts a stop to all that nonsense. And from here, Magnus Carlsen just couldn't do anything else. But after a pawn to a2, Magnus Carlsen decided to go ahead and resign. So playing the white pieces in game 8, we only have 4 games left, loses to Sergei Karjakin. And there were some fireworks after this game. Magnus Carlsen was not pleased with his performance. And if you kind of heard about the press conference afterward, Sergei Karjakin, as you can imagine, was getting a lot of interviews before the big press conference where both of the players sit down with the press and they answer questions. So they kind of had Magnus Carlsen sitting on stage at the press conference by himself while they were on the side interviewing Sergei Karjakin. Magnus Carlsen not too pleased about that and stormed off in somewhat odd fashion and was not present for the press conference, which I'm not even sure if that's allowed by rules. He may get fined or something. I'm not sure. A lot of people on social media talking about how, that's disrespectful. I'm not going to comment on that. But I will say he did show up to the press conference, kind of had him sitting there. He was somewhat sad to see him sitting there in misery, and then did storm off. It was kind of odd to see him storm off. So all in all, Magnus Carlsen, very, very tough game in game number 8. But congrats to Sergei Karjakin for sticking in there, playing a great defense, and then just slowly waiting for Magnus Carlsen to make a mistake, which usually doesn't happen at all, and then finding that right opportunity. And then after pawn to h4, he did find the correct line with pawn to a2. So I think the rest of the games are going to be pretty exciting. Magnus Carlsen, I don't think, has been putting his opponent in too many crazy positions. I'm hoping that after this is kind of a wake-up call that says, your opponent is no slouch. He will win if you don't try something different. Sergei Karjakin will easily win this tournament if we see the similar stuff that we've seen up until this point. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this game. I think the most exciting so far, we haven't really seen the Cole system played at high level in a while. And to see all these variations and then to see at the very end Magnus Carlsen lose, kind of crazy. So I'm excited. We have a game off or day off, and then Magnus Carlsen comes back with the black pieces to defend on Wednesday. So everyone, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.